Have you ever mistaken someone's silence for hatred, only to discover it was hiding something far more complicated? That was the question I kept asking myself every morning as I stepped through the glass doors of Hawthorne Creative in downtown Chicago. The lobby smelled like fresh coffee and polished marble. The elevators chimed every few minutes, and everyone seemed to greet each other with easy smiles, except for one person. Noah Carter never smiled at me. At least, not once in the 11 months we'd worked together. Every interaction between us was painfully brief. Revision needed. Deadline moved. Check your email. His voice was calm, professional, and impossibly unreadable. If I presented an idea during a meeting, he would nod once before pointing out everything that could be improved. If someone else suggested the exact same thing 5 minutes later, he'd explain it in detail without looking irritated. My coworkers insisted I was imagining things. That's just Noah. Melissa from marketing always laughed. He treats everyone like that. But I noticed the small differences. He held the elevator for everyone except me. He remembered everyone else's coffee order, but never asked about mine. During Friday lunches, he somehow always ended up sitting at the opposite end of the table. It was impossible not to take it personally. I started wondering if I'd done something wrong on my first day, something I'd forgotten while he'd never let it go. Maybe I'd interrupted him during orientation. Maybe I'd accidentally offended him without realizing it. Whatever the reason, I stopped trying. I kept conversations short, sent polished emails, and focused on my design work. It was easier pretending he didn't matter than admitting I cared what he thought. The irony was that everyone admired Noah. Clients requested him by name. Executives trusted his judgment without hesitation. Even interns spoke about him like he was some impossible standard they hoped to reach one day. They described him as dependable, patient, brilliant. I couldn't reconcile their version of Noah with the man who barely looked at me unless a project required it. Then came the announcement that changed everything. A major sportswear company had moved its campaign launch forward by 48 hours after securing a national television spot. Every department scrambled to adjust. Designers, copywriters, developers, account managers. We were all suddenly racing against a deadline no one had expected. At 4:30 on Thursday afternoon, people began receiving reassigned tasks. By 5, half the office had already canceled dinner plans. At 5:15, my inbox chimed with a calendar invite from Noah. Subject line, Final Asset Review. Time, 7 p.m. Location, Conference Room B. Required attendees, Ethan Brooks and Noah Carter. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Melissa leaned over the cubicle wall with an apologetic smile. Looks like you two drew the short straw. I forced a laugh, even though my stomach tightened. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, dark clouds gathered over the Chicago skyline, swallowing the last traces of sunlight. Most people complained about working late. I had a different problem. For the first time since joining Hawthorne Creative, I was about to spend an entire evening alone with the one coworker who seemed like he couldn't stand the sight of me. I had no idea that by the time the office lights dimmed and the building emptied, everything I believed about Noah Carter would begin to fall apart. By 6:30, the office felt like an entirely different world. The cheerful conversations had faded, computer monitors winked off one by one, and the constant ringing of phones gave way to a quiet hum from the ventilation system. Outside, rain streaked across the massive windows overlooking downtown Chicago, blurring the city lights into shimmering ribbons of white and gold. I carried my laptop into conference room, expecting awkward silence. But Noah was already there with 3 monitors connected, project files neatly organized across the table, and 2 steaming paper cups beside his computer. He glanced up for only a second before returning his attention to the presentation. The client changed the campaign order, he said evenly. We have to rebuild the first 3 sections before midnight. I nodded, setting my bag down without another word. For the next hour, the only sounds between us were keyboards clicking and occasional discussions about fonts, image spacing, and color balance. It was strangely easier than I had expected. Professional, predictable, almost comfortable. Around 8:15, the building lights automatically dimmed into their evening setting, casting the conference room in a softer glow. I rubbed my eyes after staring at design layouts for so long. Without warning, a fresh cup of coffee slid quietly across the table toward me. I looked up in confusion. Noah was already focused on his screen again. The first one went cold, he said simply. You never drink cold coffee. I stared at the cup for a moment before speaking. How do you know how I drink my coffee? He paused for the first time that evening. Every morning you buy a medium dark roast with 1 packet of raw sugar from the cafe downstairs. If the meeting starts late, you always replace it. My fingers tightened slightly around the warm cup. 11 months. I had convinced myself he barely noticed I existed. Yet somehow he had remembered something that even a few friends forgot. Before I could ask another question, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, declined the call immediately, and returned to reviewing my design mock-ups. Your typography improved, he said after another minute. Especially compared to the Henderson account. I blinked. It was the closest thing to a compliment I had ever heard from him. Thank you, I answered carefully. I spent a few weekends studying new layouts. I know. Again, such a simple answer, yet it unsettled me. How could someone seem so distant while paying attention to details I assumed nobody noticed? The rain outside intensified, drumming steadily against the windows. A notification flashed across every computer monitor in the building announcing severe weather and advising employees to avoid unnecessary travel until conditions improved. Melissa texted our team group chat saying trains were already delayed because of flooding near several stations. One by one, messages arrived from coworkers safely home, joking that we should claim overtime and order expensive takeout. Noah quietly closed the chat without responding. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the storm for several silent seconds before speaking again. Looks like we are going to be here longer than either of us planned. For reasons I still could not explain, hearing those words no longer filled me with dread. Instead, I found myself wondering if the man everyone admired and the man I believed disliked me had been the same person all along, while I had only been looking at one side of the glass. The hours slipped by almost unnoticed as the campaign slowly came together. Every completed page felt like one more piece of a puzzle finally locking into place. The storm outside showed no sign of ending. Rain continued tapping against the windows while distant flashes of lightning briefly illuminated the skyline before fading back into the soft gray darkness. Around 9:30, the office floor was completely empty. Cleaning staff quietly passed through the hallways, offering polite smiles before disappearing onto another floor. The silence inside conference room became strangely peaceful instead of uncomfortable. I found myself concentrating less on Noah's cold reputation and more on the way he worked. He never rushed anyone. He checked every detail twice, not because he expected perfection from others, but because he demanded it from himself first. Whenever he noticed an issue in my layouts, he explained exactly why it mattered instead of simply pointing out the mistake. It was patient, careful, completely different from the version of him I had built in my mind. My laptop suddenly froze while exporting several large image files. I sighed under my breath and leaned back in frustration. Before I could restart the program, Noah quietly rolled his chair beside mine. "May I?" he asked. I nodded, sliding the laptop toward him. His fingers moved confidently across the keyboard as he adjusted memory settings and reorganized the export sequence. "The software struggles with large render batches," he explained. "Separate them into smaller groups. It finishes faster." Less than 2 minutes later, the files began exporting smoothly again. "Thank you," I said, genuinely surprised. "I have been fighting that problem for months." He gave a small shrug. "Someone showed me the same trick years ago. It was such an ordinary conversation, yet it felt like discovering an entirely different language between us. The wall I believed existed did not disappear all at once. Instead, tiny cracks kept appearing every few minutes. At 10 o'clock, my stomach reminded me that lunch had been the last real meal I had eaten. Before I could suggest ordering food, Noah stood and reached for his coat. "Stay here," he said. "I will be back in 10 minutes. I frowned. "In this weather?" He looked toward the rain-covered windows. "There is a diner connected to the parking garage. It stays open all night." Before I could object, he was already gone. I expected him to return with something for himself. But 15 minutes later, he walked back, carrying 2 paper bags that filled the conference room with the smell of grilled sandwiches and tomato soup. He placed one in front of me without ceremony. "Melissa mentioned you always order turkey on sourdough." I stared at him again, unable to hide my disbelief. "You remember what everyone eats." For the first time that evening, the corner of his mouth lifted ever so slightly. "Not everyone." He opened his own meal and quietly added, Only the people I work with every day. Something shifted inside me at those words. They were simple, almost casual, yet they carried a warmth I had never expected from him. As we ate, the conversation slowly drifted beyond deadlines and presentations. We talked about favorite neighborhoods in Chicago, the endless construction on Lakeshore Drive, and the small bookstore tucked between two coffee shops where I spent most Saturday mornings. When I mentioned the bookstore by name, Noah looked genuinely surprised. "You go there too?" he asked. "Every other weekend," I answered. He lowered his eyes for a brief moment before giving a quiet laugh that sounded unfamiliar, almost shy. "Then we have probably walked past each other more times than either of us realized." For reasons I could not explain, that thought stayed with me long after the conversation moved back to work, because for the first time since I met Noah Carter, I was beginning to wonder if our story had started much earlier than I had ever noticed. By the time we finished dinner, the rain had settled into a steady rhythm that seemed determined to last until morning. The city beyond the windows looked distant and quiet, its bright streets softened by sheets of water that reflected every passing headlight. Inside the conference room, the warmth from our meals lingered just enough to make the office feel less like a workplace and more like an unexpected refuge. We returned to the campaign without needing to discuss whose turn it was to tackle each task. Somehow we had fallen into an easy rhythm. I adjusted layouts while Noah reviewed client notes, occasionally sliding a document toward me before I even realized I needed it. We hardly interrupted each other anymore. Near 11 o'clock, an email notification appeared on Noah's screen. His expression changed almost instantly. The calm focus I had grown used to over the past few hours faded into quiet concern. He excused himself with a brief apology and stepped into the hallway to answer his phone. The glass walls of the conference room muted his voice, but I noticed something I had never expected. His posture softened. He smiled. Not the polite expression people wore during meetings, but a genuine smile filled with warmth. He spoke slowly, nodding several times before laughing quietly at something the caller said. It lasted less than 3 minutes before he returned, placing his phone face down on the table as though nothing unusual had happened. "Everything all right?" I asked before I could stop myself. He looked slightly surprised that I had asked. "Yes," he answered. "My grandmother." I smiled. "She called this late?" A faint chuckle escaped him. "She forgets time whenever she finds a new recipe she wants me to try." That image caught me completely off guard. The intimidating project manager everyone admired was apparently discussing homemade recipes close to midnight. It was impossible to connect that version of Noah with the distant man I thought I knew. "You cook?" I asked. "Every Sunday," he replied. "She insists I learn one family recipe each week." He hesitated before adding, "She says good meals make difficult weeks easier." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I admitted something I rarely shared at work. My mom used to say almost the same thing. Noah looked at me with quiet interest instead of rushing back to the project. "She taught me how to bake," I continued. "Whenever life became stressful, she would hand me flour, butter, and a mixing bowl. She believed people thought more clearly after making something with their hands." His eyes drifted toward the paper bag from the diner before returning to me. "That explains the bookstore," he said. "And the sketchbook you carry every Friday." I blinked in surprise. "You noticed that too?" He nodded once. "You always leave with a different book and the same leather notebook." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "I spent almost a year convinced you barely noticed I existed." The room became unusually still. Noah lowered his gaze for several seconds before answering in a voice quieter than I had heard all evening. "That was never true." He did not explain further. Instead, he reopened the presentation and continued reviewing campaign slides with the same careful attention as before. Yet those 4 simple words echoed in my thoughts far louder than the storm outside. That was never true. As midnight approached and the office grew even quieter, I realized my certainty had completely disappeared. The man I believed disliked me had remembered my coffee order, my favorite sandwich, the bookstore I visited, and even the notebook I carried home every week. Somewhere between the deadlines, the rain, and the endless glow of computer screens, the story I had spent 11 months believing no longer made sense. We had just settled back into our work when the lights flickered once, then twice, before the entire floor fell into darkness. A quiet beep echoed from somewhere down the hallway as the building switched to emergency power. Thin strips of backup lighting glowed along the baseboards, leaving the office wrapped in a calm blue haze instead of complete blackness. The computer monitors slowly restarted, but the main network remained offline. Noah leaned back in his chair and glanced toward the ceiling with an expression that looked more amused than frustrated. "The backup servers need a few minutes," he said. "There is nothing we can do until they reconnect." For the first time all evening, neither of us had a deadline demanding our attention. The silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows while the city lights shimmered below like reflections floating on dark water. I walked toward the glass overlooking Chicago and rested one hand against the cool surface. "It looks completely different at night," I said quietly. Noah joined me a few feet away, careful to leave enough space that it never felt awkward. "I come up here sometimes after difficult meetings," he admitted. "Everything feels smaller when you look at the city from this high." I smiled. I thought I was the only one who hid by the windows. He let out another quiet laugh, the sound warmer and more natural than before. Apparently not. We stood there for a while without speaking, watching headlights weave through rain-soaked streets far below. It was surprising how comfortable silence could become when neither person felt the need to fill it. Eventually, I broke it with a question that had been sitting in my mind all evening. "Can I ask you something?" Noah turned toward me. "Of course. Why did everyone tell me you were easy to work with when I spent almost a year thinking you disliked me?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked back toward the skyline, thinking carefully before speaking. "Because I was trying very hard not to make your first year here more complicated." I frowned slightly. "That does not explain why you always kept your distance." He folded his arms loosely. "When you joined the company, you were talented but uncertain. You second-guessed every presentation, apologized for ideas that deserve confidence, and worried too much about making mistakes. If I had treated you differently than everyone else, people would have noticed. Office rumors have a way of turning simple things into unnecessary problems." I stared at him, trying to process his words. "So you stayed distant to protect me?" He nodded once. "I believe professionalism was the safest choice." Before I could respond, the emergency lights brightened as the network came back online. Monitors flickered to life across the office, pulling us both back into reality. We returned to the conference room and reopened the campaign files. But something fundamental had changed. The silence between us was no longer built on misunderstanding. Every glance carried curiosity instead of doubt. Every conversation felt easier than the last. Around 1 a.m, I caught Noah smiling as he reviewed one of my finished layouts. It was not directed at the project. It was directed at me, brief enough that he probably assumed I had missed it. I smiled back without thinking. He looked away almost immediately, slightly embarrassed, while I turned toward my screen pretending to focus on the design. Somehow, in the middle of an ordinary work night filled with rain, deadlines, and flickering lights, the walls that had separated us for 11 months had quietly begun to disappear. The campaign was finally taking shape. Every approved page, every polished graphic, and every corrected headline brought us one step closer to the finish line. The clock in the corner of my monitor quietly rolled past 1:30 in the morning, yet neither of us seemed eager to mention how late it had become. Outside, the storm had softened into a gentle drizzle, leaving the city wrapped in a silver glow beneath the streetlights. The office, once filled with hurried conversations and ringing phones, had become so quiet that I could hear the distant hum of the elevators and the occasional rumble of a train somewhere beyond the river. Noah reviewed the final presentation while I adjusted the last animation sequence. Every few minutes one of us would notice a tiny detail the other had missed, and without thinking we naturally leaned closer over the same screen, discussing color balance, spacing, or timing. There was no tension anymore. No hesitation. It felt less like working with a supervisor and more like collaborating with someone who genuinely respected my ideas. "That transition works better," Noah said as he watched the updated preview. "It gives the audience time to focus on the message." I smiled without looking away from the screen. "You were right about simplifying the first section." I kept trying to impress the client instead of communicating with them. He nodded thoughtfully. "The strongest designs usually feel effortless, even when they take the most work." I looked at him and laughed softly. "You make everything sound like life advice." He laughed too, the sound quiet but sincere. My grandmother would probably say it is. That made both of us smile again. The conversation drifted naturally after that. We talked about favorite movies, childhood hobbies, and the strange jobs we had before joining Hawthorne Creative. I admitted that I had once spent an entire summer illustrating birthday party banners for a neighborhood print shop because it was the only creative job I could find after college. Noah confessed that during graduate school he had worked every Saturday morning at his uncle's hardware store, memorizing hundreds of paint colors even though he secretly wanted to spend those hours reading novels instead. Every answer revealed another ordinary piece of the man I had spent months imagining as distant and impossible to understand. Around 2 o'clock, a message from the client arrived approving the revised campaign without requesting a single additional change. I leaned back in my chair and released a long breath I had been holding for hours. "We actually finished it," I said, almost unable to believe it. Noah looked at the confirmation email before turning toward me with a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "We did." For a brief moment, neither of us moved. Relief settled over the room like warm sunlight after a long winter afternoon. I gathered my notebook and slipped it into my backpack while Noah carefully organized the presentation files for the morning meeting. As he closed his laptop, a folded piece of paper slid onto the table. It was an old bookstore receipt. My eyes landed on the date without meaning to. It was from nearly 6 months earlier, purchased at the exact little bookstore I had mentioned. During dinner, tucked beneath the receipt was the title of the novel I had bought that same weekend. Before I could stop myself, I looked up in confusion. Noah noticed where my attention had gone, quietly picked up the receipt, and for the first time all night, seemed genuinely flustered. He slipped it back into his wallet with an awkward smile that was almost impossible to imagine on the composed project manager everyone admired. I did not ask any questions, but one impossible thought refused to leave my mind. If he had known about my favorite bookstore for months, then perhaps our paths had crossed long before that unforgettable night at the office, and perhaps I had never noticed the quiet man who had been noticing me all along. The drive home that morning felt strangely quiet. The storm had finally passed, leaving Chicago washed clean beneath a pale sunrise that painted the buildings with soft shades of gold. Noah and I barely spoke during the ride to the parking garage, yet the silence between us felt completely different from the silence that had defined the previous 11 months. It was comfortable now, almost reassuring. Before getting into our separate cars, he looked at me with the same calm expression I had grown used to throughout the night. "Get some sleep," he said. "The client presentation starts at 10 tomorrow, and I would rather have you awake than pretending coffee can solve everything." I laughed. That sounds suspiciously like life advice again. A small smile appeared on his face. My grandmother would approve. We drove away in opposite directions, but I caught myself smiling the entire way home. The following week, however, everything changed. Noah returned to being the reserved, distant manager everyone else recognized. During meetings, he addressed me by my last name instead of my first. Emails became brief again. Conversations returned to deadlines and project updates. If anyone else had watched us, they would have assumed nothing unusual had ever happened. At first, I convinced myself he was simply exhausted after the campaign. Then another week passed, and another. The warmth from that unforgettable night slowly faded beneath polished professionalism. I tried not to let it bother me, but disappointment has a quiet way of finding its place inside ordinary routines. Every morning, I caught myself hoping he would stop by my desk the way he had during those late hours. Every afternoon, I wondered if he would ask about the novel I had mentioned or the bakery near the bookstore that we had both unknowingly visited. Instead, he remained careful, distant, and impossible to read. The hardest part was knowing the version of Noah I had discovered was real. I had seen him laugh. I had watched him worry about his grandmother. I had heard him admit that he noticed far more about me than I ever imagined. None of that had been my imagination. Yet somehow it had disappeared. One Tuesday afternoon, I walked toward the executive conference rooms carrying revised design proofs when I heard familiar voices through an open doorway. I had no intention of listening, but Noah's name made me pause before I realized what I was doing. "You handled that situation exactly the right way," our creative director said. "Keeping your distance after the project was the professional decision." Noah answered quietly enough that I almost missed it. "It was necessary. You know how quickly people start talking around here," the director continued. especially when a department head spends too much personal time with someone on his own team. There was a long silence before Noah finally replied. I understand. Those two words landed heavier than I expected. My chest tightened as every hopeful conversation from that night suddenly felt different. Maybe I had misunderstood everything. Maybe the kindness, the smiles, the bookstore receipt, even the late-night conversations had only been temporary because the project demanded teamwork. Perhaps once the deadline passed, reality returned. I quietly stepped away before either of them noticed I had been there. The design proofs suddenly felt heavier in my hands than paper should. By the end of the workday, I had made a decision I never thought I would make. Whatever feelings had quietly begun growing inside me during that long night in the office needed to end before they became something I could no longer hide. If Noah had chosen distance for a reason, then the least I could do was respect the choice he had already made, even if walking away felt much harder than I ever expected. The next several days settled into a routine that felt strangely hollow. I kept my promise to myself by treating Noah exactly the way he treated me. Every conversation stayed focused on deadlines, revisions, and client feedback. I stopped lingering near his office after meetings. I stopped wondering whether he had already visited the bookstore that weekend. Most importantly, I stopped looking for the quiet smiles that had only existed during that one unforgettable night. At least, I tried to. Late Friday afternoon, our department gathered for a quarterly planning meeting. Halfway through the presentation, the director announced that several upcoming projects would be reassigned because of budget adjustments. A ripple of uneasy whispers spread across the room. Creative teams would be reduced, responsibilities merged, and some employees transferred to different offices over the next few months. My stomach tightened as I skimmed the printed agenda. My name appeared beside one of the largest accounts in the company, but there was a handwritten note beside it that simply read pending approval. After the meeting ended, everyone drifted into small conversations while I quietly gathered my notebook. Melissa caught up with me near the elevators. You do know what almost happened, right? She asked. I looked at her in confusion. What do you mean? She blinked as though she had assumed everyone already knew. 3 weeks ago, management wanted to move you to the satellite office in Milwaukee. They thought your design work would be more useful there. I stared at her. Nobody told me that. Because it never happened. She lowered her voice. Noah fought the decision. I felt the air leave my lungs. That does not make any sense. It makes perfect sense, Melissa replied. He spent almost an hour explaining why splitting you away from the creative team would damage every campaign you had helped build. I have never seen him argue that hard for anyone. Before I could respond, she was called away by another coworker, leaving me standing alone outside the conference room. My thoughts raced back to everything I had overheard days earlier. Keeping his distance had been professional, necessary. At the time, I believed those words meant I had imagined our connection. Now they sounded completely different. That evening, I stayed late to organize archived design files before the weekend. As I walked past the executive offices, I noticed Noah's door slightly open. He was inside speaking with the creative director again, but this time I had no intention of listening. I was about to continue down the hallway when my own name stopped me. You know, he still does not understand why the transfer disappeared, the director said. Noah answered with the same calm voice I knew so well. He does not need to. You could have taken the promotion in New York if you had accepted the restructuring. There was a long pause before Noah quietly replied. Not if accepting it meant dismantling the team he worked so hard to become part of. My hand tightened around the folder I was carrying. You gave up the promotion? The director asked. Noah let out a slow breath. Some opportunities cost more than they are worth. I stepped away before another word could reach me. The hallway suddenly felt far too quiet. Every assumption I had made over the past 2 weeks crumbled at once. Noah had not been pulling away because that night meant nothing. He had been carrying the weight of protecting my career, even if it meant sacrificing something he had spent years working toward. For the first time since I joined Hawthorne Creative, I realized the greatest misunderstanding between us had never been a lack of feelings. It had been the quiet sacrifices neither of us had ever found the courage to speak aloud. Monday arrived with clear skies and the kind of crisp autumn air that made downtown Chicago feel brand new. I barely noticed the weather as I walked into Hawthorne Creative carrying everything I had learned over the past few days. The lobby looked exactly the same. The elevators chimed with familiar rhythm. Coworkers laughed over fresh coffee. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Because I finally understood the truth hidden behind every careful decision Noah had made. I found him alone in conference room, reviewing presentation notes before the weekly leadership meeting. The room looked exactly as it had on the night. Everything changed, except sunlight now poured through the windows instead of rain tracing across the glass. He looked up as I entered, offering the same calm professional expression he always wore during office hours. "Good morning, Ethan," he said. "Is there something you need?" I closed the door behind me and took a slow breath. "I need you to stop protecting me by pretending none of that night mattered." For the first time since I had met him, Noah looked completely caught off guard. He set his notebook aside without saying a word. "Melissa told me about Milwaukee," I continued quietly, "and I accidentally overheard the conversation about New York." He closed his eyes for a brief moment before letting out a slow breath. "I was hoping you would never find out." "Why?" I asked. "Because I did not want you feeling responsible for choices that were mine to make." His voice remained steady, but there was an honesty in it I had never heard before. "You deserved every opportunity here because of your talent, not because someone assumed you had special treatment. I worked too hard to make sure no one could ever question that." I looked around the conference room where months of misunderstanding had quietly unraveled during one extraordinary night. "You know what hurt the most?" I asked softly, thinking that I imagined everything. Noah lowered his gaze. "I know." After a long silence, he finally admitted what neither of us had been brave enough to say. "Keeping my distance after that night was the hardest professional decision I have ever made. Every instinct told me to ask if you wanted coffee again, to recommend another bookstore, to tell you when my grandmother finally perfected the apple pie recipe she had been working on. But I was afraid that if anyone noticed how much I cared, they would stop seeing your work and start seeing rumors instead." I smiled despite the sting behind my eyes. "You spent 11 months convincing me you disliked me, then one night convincing me I was completely wrong." A quiet laugh escaped him. "That was not exactly the plan." "What was the plan?" He looked directly at me, the distance that had once lived in his eyes finally gone. "To wait until there was no professional reason left for either of us to wonder whether this was real." Before I could answer, my phone vibrated with a company-wide announcement. Noah had officially accepted a new role as Creative Strategy Director, effective immediately. The promotion moved him out of direct management over my team, eliminating the reporting relationship that had kept him so careful for so long. I looked back at him in surprise. He smiled with quiet relief. Human Resources finalized it this morning. The room filled with a comfortable silence, one that no longer hid uncertainty or fear. "So," I said with a grin, "would it finally be considered professional if I asked whether you wanted to visit that bookstore together this Saturday?" Noah laughed, warm and genuine, the same laugh I first heard beneath the sound of rain. "I was beginning to think you would never ask." As we walked out of conference room B side by side, I realized that the greatest relationships are not built through grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes they begin with misunderstandings, grow through quiet acts of kindness, and finally find their way into the light when two people decide that honesty is worth more than fear. Saturday arrived brighter than either of us expected. The heavy clouds that had dominated the city for weeks had given way to a clear blue sky, and the streets around Lincoln Park buzzed with families, joggers, and people carrying paper cups of coffee as if autumn itself had decided to slow everything down. I reached the little bookstore a few minutes early, wondering if the easy conversation we had found in the office would somehow disappear outside of work. Then I saw Noah standing near the entrance with a canvas tote bag over one shoulder and a slightly nervous smile that looked completely different from the composed confidence he carried through every meeting at Hawthorne Creative. I was starting to think I might actually be the early one, I teased as I walked over. He laughed softly. "You are exactly 3 minutes early. I have been here for 10. You planned ahead?" I wanted to make sure I did not accidentally miss you. There was something wonderfully ordinary about hearing him say that. No carefully measured words. No professional distance. Just honesty. We stepped inside together, greeted by the familiar scent of paper, cedar shelves, and fresh coffee drifting from the small cafe tucked into the back corner. I smiled as I noticed the same elderly cashier who always recommended mystery novels waving at me from behind the register. "Good to see you again, Ethan," she called. Then her eyes moved to Noah, and her smile widened. So this is the quiet gentleman who always buys the history books after you leave. I turned toward Noah with raised eyebrows. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking almost embarrassed. I usually came on Sunday mornings, he admitted. You always visited on Saturdays. You knew that? I asked. He nodded. After the third time I noticed the same sketchbook in your hands, I realized we kept missing each other by less than a day. I could not help laughing. So we have been almost meeting for months. Closer to a year, he corrected with a warm smile. We wandered through the aisles without any schedule or destination. Sometimes we stopped to recommend favorite authors. Sometimes we simply stood beside each other reading the backs of novels without saying a word. The silence felt as natural as our conversations had become. Eventually, we settled into 2 chairs beside the cafe windows with fresh coffee and slices of warm apple pie. Noah smiled after taking the first bite. My grandmother would tell me this crust needs more cinnamon. Would she really? I asked. Absolutely, he replied. Then she would ask the baker for the recipe because she believes every good dessert has something new to teach. I laughed. I think I would like to meet her someday. Noah looked at me for a long moment before answering. She would like that too. I have talked about you more than you probably realize. My heart skipped for just a second. Only good things, I hope. He smiled with quiet certainty. Only the truth. That you are thoughtful, talented, kinder than you think you are, and that somewhere between one difficult project and one unforgettable rainy night, you quietly became the person I looked forward to seeing the most. I reached across the small cafe table and gently rested my hand beside his. He met my eyes with the same calm warmth that had once been hidden behind careful professionalism. Outside, people continued walking beneath golden trees without any idea that an ordinary bookstore had become the place where 2 separate paths had finally become one, not because of perfect timing, but because both of us had finally stopped letting fear speak louder than honesty. Over the following weeks, life settled into a rhythm neither of us had expected, yet both of us quietly treasured. The biggest surprise was not that Noah and I had become closer. It was how natural everything felt once we stopped pretending we were strangers. At Hawthorne Creative, we remained every bit as professional as before, but now the invisible wall between us was gone. We no longer avoided simple conversations in the hallway. We exchanged ideas during meetings without worrying how they might be interpreted. Occasionally, one of us would leave a cup of coffee on the other's desk before an especially busy morning, always without a note because none was needed anymore. Outside the office, however, we slowly built something entirely our own. Saturday bookstore visits became an unspoken tradition. Sometimes we left carrying more books than either of us could realistically finish in a month. Other weekends we bought nothing at all and simply wandered through quiet shelves discussing favorite authors, childhood memories, and the dreams we had postponed while trying to build our careers. One Sunday afternoon, Noah finally invited me to his grandmother's house. It was a modest brick home on a peaceful street lined with maple trees whose leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and orange. The moment she opened the front door, she smiled as though she had known me for years. "So you are Ethan," she said warmly before pulling me into a gentle hug. "I have heard enough stories about you that I almost expected you to arrive carrying a sketchbook." I looked toward Noah, who suddenly seemed fascinated by the welcome mat beneath his shoes. I could not stop smiling. The afternoon passed with homemade soup, fresh bread, and the famous apple pie Noah had mentioned so many times. His grandmother insisted that everyone helped in the kitchen, explaining that good conversations always happened while preparing food together. She watched Noah and me quietly measuring ingredients, passing bowls back and forth without needing many words, and finally gave a satisfied nod. "You two already move like a team," she observed. Noah laughed softly. "That started during a campaign deadline." "No," she replied with a knowing smile. "That started long before either of you admitted it." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the neighborhood rooftops, she handed me a small recipe card written in careful handwriting. "Keep this," she said. "Every family begins with simple traditions. Recipes have a wonderful way of reminding people to come home." I carefully slipped the card into my notebook, realizing it had become one of the most meaningful gifts I had ever received. On the drive back to Chicago, neither of us hurried to fill the comfortable silence. The city lights gradually appeared on the horizon, glowing against the deep blue evening sky. Noah glanced toward me at a stoplight and smiled in the same quiet way that had first caught me completely by surprise during that unforgettable rainy night. "Thank you for today," he said. I shook my head gently. "I think I should be thanking you." He looked puzzled. "For what?" I smiled as I looked out toward the skyline ahead. "For teaching me that sometimes the people who care the most are simply the ones who struggle the hardest to say it out loud." If we had never stayed late at the office that night, I might have spent years believing the greatest misunderstanding of my life was the truth. Instead, it became the beginning of everything I had been hoping to find without even realizing it. Winter arrived quietly in Chicago, covering rooftops with a thin layer of snow that softened the sharp edges of the city. By the time December reached its final weeks, Hawthorne Creative had transformed with strings of warm lights, evergreen wreaths, and cheerful decorations that somehow made even the busiest deadlines feel lighter. The office buzzed with holiday energy as coworkers exchanged homemade cookies, wrapped small gifts, and debated whose playlist would fill the conference rooms during the final workweek before Christmas. It felt impossible to believe that only a few months earlier I had walked through these same hallways convinced Noah Carter could barely tolerate my presence. Now, whenever our eyes met across a meeting table, an almost invisible smile passed between us before either of us returned to work. It was subtle enough that no one questioned it, yet meaningful enough that neither of us ever doubted it again. One Friday afternoon, the company hosted its annual holiday gathering. Instead of formal speeches, everyone gathered around long wooden tables filled with comfort food from local restaurants while employees shared stories from the past year. Melissa stood near the center of the room laughing as she reminded everyone about the Impossible sportswear campaign that had somehow become the agency's biggest success. "I still cannot believe Ethan and Noah finished that project overnight," she said with a grin. The rest of us went home expecting disaster, and somehow they came back with the strongest presentation of the entire year. Laughter spread through the room, but I noticed Noah quietly shaking his head with the same modest smile he always wore whenever someone praised his work. Later that evening, our creative director announced one final surprise before everyone left for the holidays. The company had decided to create a new mentorship program pairing experienced leaders with younger designers who wanted to develop their careers. Instead of assigning the mentors, employees would nominate the people who had positively influenced them throughout the year. When the results appeared on the large screen, Noah's name stood at the top of the list by an overwhelming margin. The room erupted into applause. He looked genuinely surprised, thanking everyone with characteristic humility before stepping away from the microphone as quickly as possible. As people gathered around to congratulate him, I remained near the windows overlooking the snowy streets below, content simply watching the moment unfold. A few minutes later, Noah found me standing there with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "I thought we could take a short break before everyone starts looking for us again," he said with a quiet smile. I accepted the warm mug, feeling the familiar comfort that always seemed to arrive whenever he was nearby. We watched snowflakes drift beneath the streetlights while music and laughter echoed softly behind us. "Do you ever think about that first night?" I asked. Noah smiled into his cup before answering. "More often than you probably realize." "Me too," I admitted. "It is strange how one unexpected evening can change the direction of an entire life." He nodded thoughtfully. "I used to believe important moments announced themselves before they arrived. Promotions, awards, big opportunities. Now I think they usually begin as ordinary days that ask us to stay a little longer than we planned." I looked out across the glowing city and realized he was right. The evening that had once felt like an inconvenience had quietly become the foundation for every joyful memory that followed. Sometimes life does not change because of dramatic events or impossible coincidences. Sometimes it changes because 2 people choose patience over assumptions, honesty over fear, and kindness over pride. Looking back, I no longer remembered that rainy night as the evening we stayed late at the office. I remembered it as the night 2 separate lives finally slowed down long enough to truly see each other for the first time. Spring arrived almost unnoticed, replacing the last traces of winter with bright mornings, flowering trees, and longer evenings that invited people to slow down and enjoy the city again. Looking back, it amazed me how much life could change in just a few months. Hawthorne Creative was still filled with deadlines, client meetings, and creative challenges, but it no longer felt like a place where I questioned my own worth. It had become the place where I discovered that being understood could quietly transform every part of a person's life. Noah settled naturally into his new leadership role, guiding entire departments with the same calm patience that had first impressed me during our late-night project. His door was always open to anyone who needed advice, and despite the increased responsibilities, he somehow never forgot the small details that made people feel seen. Every Monday morning, a fresh cup of dark roast coffee would appear beside my workstation before I even arrived, and every Friday afternoon I would leave a new novel on his desk because I knew he would finish it before the following weekend. We never needed grand gestures to remind each other that we cared. The little routines we built together became far more meaningful than anything dramatic ever could. One warm Saturday afternoon, we returned to the bookstore where everything outside the office had truly begun. The elderly cashier greeted us with the same familiar smile before laughing softly. I was wondering how much longer it would take before you two finally looked as happy together as you always looked separately. Noah and I exchanged amused glances before smiling at the same time. Even strangers had apparently noticed the story unfolding around us long before we understood it ourselves. After browsing the shelves, we carried our books to the nearby park and found an empty bench overlooking the lake. Families spread blankets across the grass while children chased kites through the gentle breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a street musician played a quiet melody that blended perfectly with the sound of birds and rustling leaves. Noah reached into his canvas bag and handed me a brand new leather sketchbook. Inside the front cover, he had written a single sentence in careful handwriting. Some of the best stories begin after people stop assuming they already know the ending. I traced the words with my fingertips, smiling as memories of that rainy night returned with surprising clarity. If either of us had gone home on time, if the weather had been different, if we had continued believing our own assumptions instead of asking honest questions, our lives might have remained parallel lines that never truly crossed. Instead, one unexpected evening gave us the courage to see beyond first impressions and discover the quiet kindness that had been waiting there all along. As we sat together watching sunlight dance across the water, I realized love is rarely built in a single unforgettable moment. More often, it grows through ordinary conversations, shared laughter, patient understanding, and the willingness to stay a little longer when life unexpectedly asks us to. Every misunderstanding we overcame became another reason to trust each other more deeply. Every quiet sacrifice became another reminder that genuine care often speaks most clearly through actions rather than words. Whenever someone now asks me how our story began, I never start with promotions, meetings, or even that long night at the office. I simply smile and tell them that sometimes the greatest changes in life begin the moment two people finally stop looking at each other through fear and start seeing each other with honesty. Everything else has a remarkable way of finding its place after that.